Hello and welcome to Free Expression from the Wall Street Journal opinion page. I'm Gerry Baker, editor-at-large of the Journal. Thanks very much for joining us. Again, if you're not already subscribing, please do subscribe at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you do listening. This week, we're going to talk about something that's been one of the defining creeds of the progressive cultural movement, the kind of cultural hegemony that we've been subjected to over the last decade or so. And that's the idea of white guilt. In the US and the UK especially, it's become just about axiomatic in the academia, in large parts of the media and the popular culture more generally, to characterize much of our history as being one of exploitation by rapacious Europeans, Anglo-Saxons especially, of ethnic minorities, both around the world and at home.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Free Expression with Gerry Baker.
This week, I'm pleased to be joined by one of the most prominent and erudite iconoclasts on the topic of colonialism. Lord Nigel Biggar is Emeritus Professor of Moral Theology at the University of Oxford and an Anglican priest. In the last few years, he's turned his professorial eye onto the legacy of empire. First of all, he published a book a few years ago called Colonialism, A Moral Reckoning. Now, while acknowledging the many sins of the colonizers, of course, the book made the case that Western colonialism was neither entirely evil and nor certainly by any means unique in human history. He's just recently published another book on a similar topic. This one is called Reparations, Slavery and the Tyranny of Imaginary Guilt. And this, he looks in particular at the argument that because of the legacy of colonialism and particularly of slavery, that we in the West, particularly in the UK and the US, have a particular obligation, a particular debt that we owe, that we have to pay the reparations to the descendants of slaves. And he takes a very skeptical and very critical look at this. And that's why I'm delighted that he's joining me now and he can explain why it is that perhaps the case for reparations is not the case that we're often, the strong case as we're often told it is. Nigel Biggar joins me now. Professor Biggar, thanks very much for joining Free Expression.
Thanks, Gerry, for having me on.
Let me immediately put to you, if you like, the devil's advocate case. Your book, your latest book, and I want to talk to you about your other book too, your book on colonialism. Your latest book is called Reparations, Slavery and the Tyranny of Imaginary Guilt. And in it, you dissect, exactly as the title says, the case for reparations, and you find it frankly wanting, in particular because of this idea, as you talk about, of imaginary guilt. But again, let me just say, take this devil's advocate position. There is no doubt that Britain, in particular, other countries too, but Britain conducted imperial expansion, colonialism around the world, subjected a lot of people to a lot of suffering, benefited to a significant extent from exploitation of the people and of the resources of those countries, most notoriously, obviously, engaged in the slave trade, shipped hundreds of thousands of Africans in particular off to the Caribbean and North America. And as I say, it's benefited significantly from all of that. Why shouldn't we now, as we take a long historical view, why shouldn't we look at the idea that there is some justified call for a historical reckoning, for historical justice, that actually we in the West, in particular, we in Britain and the United States, obviously benefited from slavery too, that we have an obligation to those people that we exploited. Why is it imaginary guilt? Why do you call it imaginary guilt, and why is it not actually real guilt?
So Gerry, let me just start by explaining to your American listeners why they might have a stake in the debate about European and British colonialism in particular, and then I'll come to reparations, because what's remarkable about the current controversy, of course, is that the focus is on, let's say, British Empire, British colonialism, given the fact that empire and the mass migration of peoples have been universal phenomena conducted by peoples with non-white skins long before white people got into it. So the question arises as to why this focus on English-speaking colonialism, and my view is that this is an attack on the record of the West. So that's why Americans, who might well think of themselves as being anti-imperial, of course, given American origins, have a stake in this, because what's being said about the British Empire being simply a litany of racism and oppression and exploitation is being said of the West as a whole. So why does the case for reparations not make sense? First of all, because those who push this case are intent on abstracting European and British involvement in slavery, in the British case lasting mainly from about 1650 to 1800, completely out of context. Now, let me be clear. The enslavement of Africans by the British and their transportation across the Atlantic was brutal, was very brutal. But it needs to be put in context. And the context is that slavery of some kind or another, often very brutal, was a universal phenomenon practiced from ancient times well into the 19th century. So that, for example, even slaves who escaped from the plantations in Jamaica in the 1700s into the forested interior, some of them kept slaves of their own. And I was in North Carolina a couple of years ago, went to the Museum of the History of North Carolina and discovered that on the eve of the American Civil War, there were 30,000 freed African-American slaves in North Carolina, some of whom kept slaves of their own. So one thing we need to bear in mind is that slavery was a universal phenomenon practiced by the native peoples of the Northwest Pacific, practiced by the Comanche and the Zulu and the Maori. Now, it may puzzle us as to why that was the case, but it really was the case. So European involvement in slave trading and slavery was nothing extraordinary. And the second reason why the claim made against the British in particular for reparations for slavery, and it's been made cheekily, in my view, recently in the last few weeks by the African Union of States in Africa. The main argument against that, Gerry, is that the British were among the first peoples in the history of the world to abolish the trade and the institution, and then to use their hegemonic imperial power in the 19th century to suppress slavery from Brazil across Africa to Australasia. And African rulers generally resisted and opposed British abolition. And in 1850, 20 years after the British had abolished slavery in the empire, in the British Empire, the Fulani people of what's now northern Nigeria were running vast slave plantations, employing or deploying, since the slaves, of course, weren't given wages, deploying 4 million slaves, equivalent to the total number of slaves in the United States at that time.
It probably is worth saying, though, that, what was it, I think in the 1830s, Britain did actually compensate, when it abolished slavery, compensated the slave owners, but not the slaves themselves. So the idea that I mean, obviously that was because of deprivation of property as it was seen at the time.
Yes.
But that should that not enter our moral calculus somewhere, that actually these owners of slaves, the slave drivers, received financial compensation, and yet the victims of slavery itself didn't?
Yeah. That's a point that's often made. So let me address that, and then I'll go back and address the point you made earlier about the profits the British made from slavery. So on the issue of compensation, first of all, the compensation was paid because in the wake of the French Revolution, the British government was extremely reluctant to override property rights. And in addition, in order to get the act abolishing slavery through Parliament, this was a necessary compromise. The abolitionists in Britain were not happy with it, but they regarded it as a necessary compromise. And as for why, the slaves were emancipated. In some cases, they were given some kinds of aid to begin their new lives. But no, that they weren't, as it were, compensated for the years of unremunerated labor. Why was that? Well, it's partly because the 19th century government did not have the resources. I mean, the payment of compensation to slave owners, I think, ate up 40% of the UK government's revenue at that time. So the state couldn't possibly remunerate. And by the way, if we're going to think about compensating slaves for unpaid labor, unfairly paid labor, then of course there are millions and millions of white industrial workers who were exploited, and if paid something, not paid much, by the same standard, they should deserve compensation as well. But there's a limit to the extent to which we can go back in time and try and make up historic injustices, because, Gerry, history is just an ocean of injustice. On the issue of contribution that slave trading and slavery made to Britain's industrial prosperity, this is controversial. If you're a Marxist and follow Eric Williams, the Trinidadian historian and then Prime Minister, and his book Capitalism and Slavery, published in 1940, then you will believe dogmatically that slavery and slave trading made, quote, an enormous contribution to Britain's prosperity. Most economic historians now reckon the contribution somewhere between small and modest, and the most eminent historian of the transatlantic slave trade and Atlantic slavery, David Eltis, he reckons the contribution was small, and when he talks about the contribution of slave trading to the wider economy of Liverpool, which was Britain's premier slave trading port in about 1650, the word he uses to describe the contribution of slavery to that economy is trivial. So anyone who says without qualification that slavery and slave trading made an enormous or significant or central contribution to Britain's prosperity is not being honest, because the fact is it's highly controversial, and most historians think that's not true.
Just back to your first point that you make very well, and you make it very, very well in the book. And by the way, you talk also about this in your previous book, and that's another topic I want to get onto, the broader question of colonialism. But you make the point very well that Britain was by no means, Anglo-Saxon world was by no means unique in benefiting from slavery and in practicing slavery. It was, as you talked about it in North America, among North American Indians. It was practiced among the Africans from whom the slave population was being drawn. We know very, very well how widely practiced it was in the ancient world, how widely practiced it was in the Ottoman Empire. And so absolutely, you can see that I can take the point that what is special about the British experience. But I suppose part of the answer to that is, well, that's not an argument. That's not a powerful argument against our own responsibility to take seriously our own responsibilities, especially Britain was not anymore much, but perhaps was a Christian country, a country that was whose values and ideals were based on equality and Christian, the Christian ideals. You yourself are a moral theologian and a priest. It's not quite good enough, is it, to say that, well, just because the Comanches did it or African tribes did it, that somehow exonerates us from our own particular responsibility, given our own moral codes and the way in which our own morality has matured, shall we say, over the last century or two. That doesn't really exonerate us, does it, from a particular responsibility to think about the legacy that we have and how we should tackle that legacy?
Yes and no, Gerry. I mean, first of all, let's be clear, and of course we agree on this, but your word exoneration muddies the waters a bit. No white person living is responsible for what happened 2 centuries ago. So we're not guilty. Yes, we are responsible for considering what our duties might be now to the descendants of those who were enslaved. I agree with that. But as Frederick Douglass, the famous African-American abolitionist, said, as far as the slaves who were worked to death are concerned in the early 1800s or 1700s, there is nothing we can do to compensate. We can't compensate for that injustice. We can't compensate for the people who were burned alive. We can't compensate for all the injustices done to early industrial workers. I mean, there's an awful lot of injustice we just can't do anything about. So that's one thing. Secondly, yes, we had to consider what our responsibilities are now, and so certainly we should address present unjust disparities between ethnic groups. And if it's true that the descendants of black slaves are in our societies, whether in Britain or in America, if they are suffering unjust advantage or at least unequal advantage, then we should seek to address those. Although in Britain, right now, the descendants of Caribbean slaves, so Caribbean Britons, whilst doing worse than, let's say, Britons from West Africa or Asian Britons, are doing better than poor whites. Right?
Right.
So I'm all for addressing, as it were, present injustices, but trying to, as it were, isolate a particular group, black people, and saying, we need to address what happened to them 200 years ago, but we can ignore what happened to exploited whites. It seems to me to be, if I may put it bluntly, racist. It's racially discriminatory. Now the claim is made that current woes of, let's say, people in the West Indies or the Caribbean are because of slavery. Well, my view of that is it may be true, but it needs to be demonstrated, because most of us 200 years ago, our ancestors suffered, mine did, but a lot's happened between now and then, and I'm not obviously suffering from what they suffered. And against the argument that contemporary descendants of slaves in the Caribbean are suffering from what happened to their ancestors 200 years ago, are certain facts. And one fact is that, oddly, the effects are various. So the people in Barbados are actually doing rather well. They're doing a lot better than people in Nigeria, some of whom were slave raiders and slave traders and slave owners. And they're doing a lot better than people in Jamaica, who are also the descendants of slaves. And why are they doing better? Partly because their post-colonial government has managed their economy better, not to do with the effects of slavery. So the point with the major problem, I think, with trying to deal with what happened 200 years ago is that all sorts of other causes have intervened to change the fates of the descendants of the oppressed 200 years ago. So that rather than try and unravel the past and identify which effects are due to what happened 200 years ago, let's address present injustices as effectively as we can. But let's also be, as it were, colorblind, because there are lots of people who are white or not black who are also suffering disadvantage.
Do you think there's any circumstances in which a current generation in a nation owes somehow, or indeed is owed, an historic debt? As you said, nobody's around today in Britain or America owns slaves, and yet, of course, one can postulate circumstances in which a nation has committed terrible crimes. You talk about Germany in the 1930s and 40s,
Sure.
and the extent to which
Sure.
Germany was held institutionally, nationally responsible for that, as well as the individuals, obviously, at the trials. Are there any circumstances in which people who are simply the successors, the heirs and successors of a regime, however wicked and evil and terrible, that they should be held responsible, as it were, for the sins of their fathers?
No, absolutely. So, I mean, the idea that if you or I do someone else an injustice, we owe them an apology and we owe them some kind of compensation or restitution or reparation, that's just moral common sense. But as I say, the longer time intervenes, the causal connection between the fates of the descendants of the original victims is affected by other things. Some of them prosper quite well, and some of them don't prosper so well. But also in terms of British responsibility, I mean, I think that not only did the British abolish slavery and emancipate slaves, as I said earlier, they then spent a lot of money and a lot of lives suppressing slavery from Brazil to New Zealand. So in a certain sense, in a rough sense, the British have done penance. And as Douglas said, I mean, in a sense, there's no way we can make up for what some of our ancestors did in the past. And most of our ancestors somewhere did something horrible in the past we can't do anything about. but the British did what they could. So an argument would be that penance of some kind has been paid.
What about America? I mean, again, much of the focus of the book is on Britain and the specific case, and we should talk about this a little bit. That the Church of England, in particular, has set aside a significant amount of money to which you've been very critical of, so for these supposed reparations. But I want to bring it to the United States. Is there a difference here? I mean, obviously, to some extent, the United States has institutionally been engaged in this debate for 150 years since the end of the Civil War, since Reconstruction, but it's actually been engaged in what could be termed efforts at reparation. The whole process of affirmative action, to a very large extent, has been justified, legally and politically, as to some extent redressing the injustice of slavery. Is it different here in the United States? I mean, and of course, the debate about reparations is quite live here. There are governors of major states like California here that actually believe there should be financial reparations paid to the descendants of slaves, as you know. Is the US in a different position from what you're arguing about Britain?
Yeah, I mean the history is different, of course, because there was no slavery in Britain since the medieval period, whereas slavery in America lasted until the mid-19th century. That's different. But I suppose it could be argued by analogy with what I was saying in terms of British suppression of slavery, that in the Civil War, many Americans paid with their lives to. Now I grant that the Civil War wasn't simply fought to emancipate slaves; it was fought to save the Union. But part and parcel of that became the emancipation of slaves. So a lot of people, yes, black as well as white, but white as well as black, paid highly. Some of them with their lives. I think 600,000 died in the Civil War. So that's a certain kind of penance. And then, yes, America has, of course, after emancipation, African Americans continue to suffer various kinds of discrimination well into the 20th century. But over time, America has sought to remove discrimination and sought to provide African Americans with help, affirmative action to overcome their disadvantages, and that has been somewhat successful and should continue insofar as there continue to be disparities in wealth between whites and blacks. But again, I mean, the problem with as it were saying, well, okay, the U.S. taxpayers or state taxpayers ought to fund compensation to the descendants of African American slaves. Two problems with that is an awful lot of U.S. taxpayers are not white; they're Asian, for example. They had nothing whatsoever to do with white oppression of blacks. Is it fair for them to start to pay for what some whites did a century and a half ago? And also, some African Americans are thriving very well. Not all. Do they also deserve compensation? So again, I think trying to go back to the 1860s and try and set things right there is not rationally possible without doing various forms of other injustice. Far better to focus on current unfair disparities, current unfair disadvantages, and to keep on removing them. And should I say, although America's attempts to rid itself of racism and the effects of racism, they've not been perfect. They still haven't been perfected. But I can point at several countries in the world where nothing's been attempted.
Yeah.
And if you look at the World Values Survey of 2023, Anglo-Saxon countries as a whole do a whole lot better than China or Russia or Iran or North Korea in terms of racial prejudice.
I want to talk a little bit about your earlier book, which you published a few years ago, which was a terrific book. 22 was it? It was published, Colonialism, a moral
23.
Colonialism, a moral reckoning. I thought I found it very persuasive. I think it's fair to say that it's become axiomatic in much of British and American discourse and education and culture and the media and everything else to just assert that colonialism is a terrible thing, a terrible crime visited upon hapless innocent people. Any benefits that might have accrued were purely incidental and don't in any way come close to making a moral case for colonialism. You take that on again. You don't remotely suggest there were not there were not iniquities, obviously, of colonialism, and some terrible things were done. Just give us, if you would, very briefly, an account of that moral reckoning. I mean, again, you make the point that Britain was by no means, Britain and other European countries were by no means alone in pursuing colonialism. They weren't the first. They certainly weren't. They probably aren't the last. But also, you talk about the benefits that both the motivations of the colonists, the extent to which they were able to realize some of those benevolent motivations, and indeed the benign effects. Just give us a sense of that moral reckoning, if you would.
Yeah. So one line of argument I push is the following. I mean, an important part of the phenomenon of European colonization was the mass migration of peoples, particularly in North America and then subsequently Australia. And of course, this had a devastating effect on Native Americans. Mainly because of disease brought inadvertently, but it was very, very tough. But what I say is, let's be clear here: the mass migration of peoples is a universal phenomenon. In the 1600s, the Iroquois Native Americans expanded northwards to displace the Huron, who fled westwards and displaced other Native American peoples. And the Iroquois had a quaint method of absorbing vanquished peoples. They adopted the women and children, and the men they ate. In the 1700s, the Comanche expanded, I think, eastwards, overwhelmed the Apache, and created what one historian calls a vast slave economy in the southwest of what's now the United States. 1820s, the Zulu expand westward, displacing other African peoples, and conducted at least one war of extermination. In 1835, the Maori sailed or paddled eastwards from what's now New Zealand to the Chatham Islands, where they found the Moriori people, 10% of whom they slaughtered and the rest of whom they enslaved. When the British Admiral Arthur Phillip arrived in Sydney Cove in South East Australia in 1788, I think, with his fleet of convict ships, he commanded his men to share their catch of fish with the Aboriginal peoples he found there. He kept open house. Aboriginals walked into his house and sat down and ate with him. Now, the story thereafter in Australia was not so happy, but my point is this. Whatever the woes that European colonization of Australia caused, and it did cause woes, Aboriginal Australians should thank God it was the British who came and not the Maori. So that's one point. I guess the other point in terms of, I don't, as you say, pretend that the British Empire didn't do awful things, but my riposte to criticism of the British Empire is to say, name me any long-standing state, 400-year-old state, that didn't preside over bad things. And by the way, the Brits chalked up some major humanitarian achievements, namely the abolition of slavery and suppression of slavery worldwide, but also between May 1940, when France fell, and June 1941, when the Nazis invaded Soviet Russia, the British Empire offered Nazi Germany the only military resistance, with the sole exception of Greece. So whatever you think about the overall moral record of the British Empire, you cannot say that British Empire simply equals evil.
Yeah, so it's at least a complex. And again, give us some. There are people who talk about, and again, you talk about this a little bit in the book. The benefits, if we can put it that way, of order, of stability. There are people. There's been some work done. Not this. Yours is as you very rightly point out in the book, is a work of moral, almost sort of moral reckoning, moral philosophy. Yes. There are other economists who've studied this, and I know it's controversial. Some have found that countries that had British colonial structures and institutions actually had much more successful economies post decolonization than others. I mean, again, I'm not asking you to give us weigh it in the balance, but again, give us this broader sense of moral questions.
Yeah, well, let me. I mean, since people, if they know anything about the British Empire, know about its evils. Let me talk up more of
Right,
its
exactly.
goods.
Yeah.
So on the economic point, yes, insofar as colonial government provided stability, it encouraged British investors, and up until 1930, the British were the largest overseas investors in the world. It encouraged British investors to invest in, for example, Australia. So by the 1890s, and I was really surprised to read this, Australia was per capita the wealthiest country on earth. And it had only been colonized 100 years before. And now Aboriginal Australians, most of them, get to participate in that in the same way that native Canadians get to participate in one of the wealthiest and most liberal countries on earth. So that's one of the economic benefits: stable government and followed by investment that gives all its peoples a measure of prosperity. Another export that some countries benefited from was the export of liberal institutions, of a free press and an independent judiciary, so that under colonial government, the press, sometimes owned not by Brits but by Indians or Chinese or Southern Africans, the press could be fiercely critical of colonial government. And sometimes the judiciary, for example, during the Mau Mau emergency in Kenya in the 1950s and 60s, an independent judiciary could be fiercely critical of colonial government. Now, the point here is that there are some countries nowadays, let's say China, let's say Russia, let's say Iran, let's say North Korea, nowadays where that is not true now. So at least relative to some regimes nowadays, the introduction of liberal institutions, liberal here meaning independent of government and therefore able to hold government to account, was a benefit, and countries like South Africa and India still benefit from it.
How do you assess the kind of the moral calculus of the motivations? On the one hand, you did have the Christian missionary zeal obviously was part of it. Some people said, well, either yes or no, but either way, it was a straight racism. People, white people thinking they were superior, and again, whether these people needed to be converted or just subdued or whatever. How do we assess the moral balance of intentionality when it comes to the empires?
Yeah, so the first thing to get into our heads is no one woke up in London one Sunday morning and decided, "Ooh, let's go conquer the world. That would be fun. We like to oppress foreign peoples." Of course, it wasn't like that. It was ad hoc, and the motives were all sorts. So trade was a major motive. That's why the English pitched up on the shores of India in the 1600s. In the case of mass migration to North America, of course, it was English, Scots, and Irish. Fleeing poverty and famine, and sometimes religious persecution in the British Isles, and who can blame them? And in the case of, later on in the 19th century, there was a motivation, a humanitarian motivation, to emancipate slaves, as I've said, and the concern about slaves expanded into a general concern about the plight of native Aboriginal indigenous peoples. So there were a mixture of motives, but for sure, trade was probably an early one and a constant one. I'm not a Marxist. I have no objection to people making a profit. But the trade didn't always just benefit London. So, for example, from about 1846 thereafter until about 1920, the British Empire supported free trade and the free exchange of ideas. So Indian entrepreneurs were able to send their sons to Cambridge University, and the sons went to Manchester and observed industrial processes, and they took back to India know-how and expertise, and they built steel mills and textile mills owned by Indians in India, which by 1930 made India one of the largest steel producers in the world. And one of the family firms that was founded under the British Raj and whose sons went to Cambridge now operates under the name of Tata. The Tata conglomeration now employs 60,000 people in Britain and owns what's left of the British steel industry. So the benefits went both ways, not just one way.
And I wanted to bring it sort of right up to the present and talk about the intellectual climate that we find ourselves in, and that you in particular found yourself in, writing these very important and, as I said at the beginning, iconoclastic books. Tell us a little bit about how that has been for you and how that's been changing. I know the first book, the Colonialism, the Moral Reckoning book, you initially had a contract with a publisher that was around the time of the George Floyd murder and the kind of frenzy of race-based sort of identity politics that came after that. And I think they cancelled, and then I'm glad to say our sister publisher, HarperCollins, then published that book. Then, of course, you published this. Tell us a bit about you've been at Oxford. You were at Oxford, I think, the time when we had the protests about, again, in the wake of the George Floyd murder. We had the Rhodes Must Fall campaign. For those who don't know, Cecil Rhodes, was a huge benefactor of Oxford University, and many statues and institutions are named there after him. Was widely accused of obviously being a racist and an imperialist because of South Africa, Southern Africa, and there was a big campaign. Rhodes Must Fall campaign was to get rid of him. We saw this outpouring, this frenzy of activism, and then you come along in the middle of all this with a book that basically says, "Hey, hold on, colonialism wasn't so bad. It was actually did lots of good things." Give us a sense of how that was, and also whether you think that pretty kind of oppressive intellectual climate may now be changing. Maybe that oppression is alleviating somewhat. Give us your sense of how it's been.
Yes. So Gerard, I first fell into the culture wars over colonial history in 2017 when I found myself unexpectedly the object of an attempt to shut down a research project on ethics and empire that I and an imperial historian had set up. And that was quite unnerving. I was the object of 3 online protests. And so clearly then I realized we have a problem in academia of some ideological, zealous, for want of a better word, progressive historians who not only don't agree with me, who not only don't want to listen to me, but are determined to make sure no one else listens to me.
Right. That is their way.
So that led me to the problem. But I've survived, and yes, Bloomsbury, who contracted me to write a book on colonialism, then got cold feet and announced in 2021 that they were going to postpone publication indefinitely because public feeling was unfavorable, and that was at the time devastating. But yes, HarperCollins came to my rescue. The book got published, and it's now sold over 70,000 copies, which was 3 times what Bloomsbury predicted it would sell. So actually looking back from this point of view in 2025, I'm actually quite hopeful because the book did get published. It has sold very well. I was also involved in helping to set up the Free Speech Union in the UK, which now has 40,000 subscribing members and has spawned FSUs in New Zealand, Australia, Canada, Switzerland.
I should say you've been ennobled by you're a member of the House of Lords now.
I was, and had it not been for my enemies, Gerry, no one knew who I was. But thanks to my enemies, I am where I am. But also, I'm here in New York at the moment to raise funds for the Farris Foundation, which is an Oxford-based foundation designed to put money behind research that thinks that Western civilization has a lot to be said in favor of it. So designed to push back against the domination of the arts and humanities in the English-speaking world by progressive obsessions with race and gender and decolonization.
Is that changing? Obviously, we're seeing here this some would regard as a kind of an assault on the oppressive environment at universities by the Trump administration. No one, I think, seriously would argue that there hasn't been an incredibly intellectually exclusive environment. Maybe that's maybe by use of force, as it were, by use of threats, getting them to change is not the best way to do it. But I'm wondering in Britain, at Oxford and Cambridge, where there's been not quite, I think probably not quite as extreme, but there's been some of that. Is that loosening at all? Do you sense that the things are moving in a different direction?
Yes, I think I can say they are loosening. Although you're right, I don't think things in Britain were ever as bad as they appear to have been in the likes of Harvard, and so our Faris Foundation, which seeks to, we're independent of the university, but we want to inject people and ideas into the university that, as I say, are more pro-Western civ. We've actually found a receptive environment there. And one of the advantages, those of us who want to combat the domination of authoritarian progressive ideology, is as you know, we have a pretty vigorous right of centre press in the UK, and they're very happy to make public when universities are failing to uphold free speech and allow the likes of me to speak and to pursue my research. And I must point out that in spite of attempts to shut me down in 2017 in Oxford, I got a word from the top of the university that the head of the university had my back, and they were not going to yield to pressure to shut me down. Although I do observe this was communicated to me by a messenger who insisted we meet in a deserted cafe behind a screen. So there's good news and bad news. I mean, there is fear.
Home of lost causes and impossible beliefs, as I recall from the old poem. Yes, yeah.
Yes, there is fear, but I'm encouraged by what's been achieved in the last 5 years.
Well, so are we, and we're all the beneficiaries of your scholarship and your wisdom, Professor Nigel Biggar. Thank you very much indeed for joining Free Expression.
Thanks, Gerry, very much.
That's it for this week's episode. Thanks very much indeed for joining us. Hope you'll join us again next week. In the meantime, have a great week and speak to you then.